You've surely seen or heard of these movies. It shows that a pirate life is one that sails the seas plundering for booty. But what was the real story of pirates, especially in the Caribbean? Who were the real pirates of the Caribbean? What made them and what did they do on a day-to-day basis? This is the real story of the pirates of the Caribbean. During the 1500s to 1830s, piracy in the Caribbean was a particular issue, but it wasn't until the 1650s until the 1720s where piracy was a major issue, sometimes called the Golden Age of Piracy. During this time, there were whole port cities made for pirates in the Caribbean, like Port Royal, Tortuga, and Nassau, the last one now the capital of the Bahamas. And in general, whenever a lucrative trade begins between two continents over water, pirates will emerge. We saw them in the Mediterranean, Indian Oceans, and nowadays in the Horn of Africa. This particular booming trade was found inside of the Caribbean at this time, which started to be colonized for growing products which couldn't survive in Europe. The magical product was sugar, which the Europeans went crazy for after being introduced to it. Tobacco was also farmed, and gold and silver from the New World passed by the Caribbean too. The other way, the Europeans would bring slaves to work on their colonies. All of these boats were passing by ripe for the plunder, and pirates took advantage of it. But was there anything else that made the pirates spring up in this sea? What did the Caribbean look like at this time? The early Caribbean political scene was one dominated by Spain, and some Portuguese influence was there too. Spain had the most colonies in the region, and by the 1600s they had many of the region's major cities like Havana, Cartagena, San Juan, and Santo Domingo. But also in the 1600s, a little country called England's economy started to explode. And being an island, they realized that during times of civil peace, there was no way for anyone else to attack them if they had a beasted up navy. So the English invested heavily into the seas. At the same time, there was also peace and prosperity in France too. So both the English and French started their own Caribbean and American colonies. 80 years later or so, after a pretty major war, the Dutch became the European center of business, inventing some maritime beauties like the flute, which allowed them to trade with ease. However, the Dutch were too obsessed with spices to focus on the sugar market, investing more in the East Indies rather than the West Indies. It's also important to note that in the early Caribbean, the Spanish had the only real self-sustaining colonies, whereas everyone else is needing materials to ship in quite regularly. The Spanish domination of the seas meant that the pirates were not too common yet, as they would be trampled by Spanish ships. In fact, Spain has a treasure fleet that would sail fairly regularly to collect the New World loot. This would consist of hundreds of ships which no single pirate ship could ever even think of defeating, but it made a very different type of pirate. A privateer was a pirate hired by a nation to plunder enemy ships. The English and French used this quite often against the Spanish in this period, and then tragedy struck. Europe, beefing about religious differences, decided to have a 30-year-long war called the 30 Years' War. Everyone was involved, and everyone needed their troops and fleets in Europe for this fighting. Of course, some fighting did bleed into the Caribbean, but it wasn't built up enough yet for major fighting to happen here. This war meant less resources were going to colonizing and defending the colonies. During this time, it wasn't necessarily pirates who were going around the Caribbean, but privateers raiding Spanish colonies. But after 30 years, the war was over. Just kidding, not for Spain and France, who fought a Franco-Spanish war right after. It was during this time when England took Jamaica from Spain for themselves. Now Spain went from having a monopoly over Caribbean trade to being one of the weaker powers there. The golden age of piracy started when peace happened in Europe, meaning production boomed, sugar appetites were up, and trade had to flow. The war left a surplus of sailors who were now unemployed, many turning to the life of the seas. The golden age of piracy was split in roughly 3 phases, not really specific to the Caribbean. The first phase was between 1650 and 1680, called the buccaneering phase. This is when English and French pirates would attack weak Spanish fleets. The second phase, called the Pirate Round, in the 1690s to 1710s, pirates would sail across the entire globe to rob Muslim trading empires in the Indian Ocean. And the last phase was between 1715 and 1726, when after the War for Spanish Succession, a new wave of unemployed sailors became pirates. During this golden age, the English and Dutch had a bigly huge trade war, and the French and Dutch had a normal war. This led to the English and French becoming the largest Caribbean powers by 1720, and honestly, it was mainly the British. They became powerful enough to successfully fight off pirates and realized that peaceful trade was way more profitable than hiring privateers to destroy your competition. So pirates slowly dwindled out in the Caribbean after the 1720s, becoming less and less important. The last pirate haven lasted until 1718, called the Republic of Pirates. In a rather fitting end to the golden age of piracy, the Republic of Pirates did not go out in a massive war, but a small skirmish and a pardon for all pirates to turn themselves in. How was being a pirate though? Spending all your time with your mateys on the high seas while getting some nice booty? Was the life of a pirate worth it? Well, most pirates were retired sailors who were disenchanted with the hierarchies and lack of pay involved. This turned sailors who wanted to actually make money to the life of piracy. Famous pirate captain Black Bart once said, "In an honest service, there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. A merry life and a short one shall be my motto," which pretty much tells you all you need to know about a pirate's life. There is more freedom and relaxing than life in the Navy. It was usually better, but also usually shorter too. A pirate made more money and lived in a more democratic ship than any boat in the Navy. A crewmate made 1/5 of the share as the captain, which is actually extremely fair compared to most businesses in history. A pirate got to vote, but in order to do that, they usually needed to take a pirate code, swearing on the Bible, sword, cannons, or human skulls. Some examples of rules and pirate codes include the right to vote, the right to bear arms, the right to a share of loot, no gambling, sometimes no smoking, no women on the ship, no abandoning the pirate ship, nighttime at 8 p.m. in the cabins, no stealing, keeping your weapons clean, and no fraud of any kind. Breaking these rules usually meant death. But some other punishments were cutting your limbs off, shooting you in the leg, or leaving you on a deserted island while also shooting you in the leg. But also, whatever punishment the captain and majority deem fit, which is pretty democratic for a cruel ending. Pirate warfare was not a swashbuckling time either. It usually involved trying to capture the enemy and torture them as much and as brutally as possible before killing them. Food was scarce, usually just hardtack, scurvy was rampant, and these ships were disgusting, usually filled with flies and maggots. So if you're thinking the life of a pirate might be nice, you might want to think again. But for some people, they got so much more glory or freedom even after all of these horrible aspects that the pirate life was just right for them. For example, Blackbeard is probably the most famous pirate of all time, and even though he worked mainly off the American coast, he dipped his feet into Caribbean waters every now and then. People describe him as a fierce, raging guy which struck fear into anyone that looked at him. He also had a really big boat too. This made him one of the toughest and most well-known pirates out on the seas until the British Navy captured him and cut off his head. Another captain is Black Bart, maybe the GOAT of all pirates. He sunk, captured, and pillaged over 400 ships. He moved to the Caribbean after sailing most of his life off the coast of Guinea and was possibly the most democratic pirate there was. After the golden age of piracy, he sailed back to Africa where he met his end fighting in a battle. Two other pirates, even though most ships had no women policies, were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both of these pirates worked under Captain Calico Jack. Even though they were women, they still murdered brutally like any good pirate should. Mary Read ended up being captured and died in prison, whereas Anne Bonny went missing and it is unknown what happened to her. The last group of pirates are slave pirates. African slaves were living some of the worst lives in the Caribbean. They had nothing really to lose and found freedom and equality in pirating. By the early 1700s, it's estimated that about 30% of pirates in the Caribbean were black. So is the pirate's life meant for you? Are you meant to roam the high seas in the Caribbean, cutting off others' legs, suffering from disease, but also living democratically and free in a time full of absolute monarchs? Caribbean pilots were born out of a political struggle between the Spanish and English empires trading massive amounts of sugar from the Caribbean to Europe. They flourished after times of war and stopped when the British Empire could dominate the seas. The life was more fair and high-paying than a sailor's job, but there was serious risk, and your life would often end up being shorter than it should have been. So would you have become a pirate? Would you be a real pirate of the Caribbean?